Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, welcome to the World Economic Forum panel discussion on the global economic outlook. I am Eric Schatzker of Bloomberg Television, and I am delighted to serve as your moderator today. This topic, of course, is a mainstay of the World Economic Forum, and that's because it's always relevant. In the news business, we call it an evergreen. In this globalized world, no government, no business can afford to be ignorant of the forces driving the economy forward or the policies that help to define it, ideally for the better, but sadly, often for the worse. We are fortunate, as you probably know, to have an outstanding group of panelists. They probably need no introduction before an audience like this, but please allow me a few words anyway. Sitting immediately to my left here is Henrique Meirelles. He is the finance minister of this great country, Brazil. In addition to his service in the current government, Mr. Meirelles has had a distinguished career in banking, as an elected representative in Congress, and as governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. To his left is Daniel Funes de Rioja. He is chairman of the B20, a business organization that functions in concert with G20, over which Argentina is currently presiding as president. Dr. Funes de Rioja is a lawyer, he's an academic and a business leader, and he has dedicated much of his career to studying and shaping labor relations and government policy. Immediately to his left is Andres Velasco. He's a professor at Columbia University in New York. He's an expert in economics and international finance and development, and he too has served as Minister of Finance in his native Chile. And immediately to my right is Hans-Paul Böckner. He's chairman of the Boston Consulting Group, global chairman, one of the world's top consulting firms, where he built the financial services practice before becoming president and CEO in 2004. So as you can see, we have a great deal of experience and knowledge from which to draw. I would like to remind our panelists and inform our audience that in the course of our discussion today, we have a shared commitment to answering a central question. Are policymakers prepared for potential shifts in capital flows in this new environment? Our plan is to talk as a panel for about 40 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to you, members of the audience, to pose questions of your own. So please, when the time comes, don't be shy. As always, we request that you silence your phones, and if you must answer a call, please take it outside. Let us begin. I think the best way to start is perhaps by establishing some context for this discussion. And given that we are in Brazil, and given that, Mr. Meirelles, you are the finance minister, I would like to pose the first question to you. But of course, the purpose here is for us to have a discussion. So you will not see me posing the same question in rapid-fire fashion to all of our panelists. They're here to talk with each other as much as they are to heed my instructions. So, Mr. Minister, if I may, how healthy is the global economy? Or does it seem healthier than it really is because the post-crisis recovery was, and in many cases remains, so slow?
I think that the world economy is going well from our vantage point. I think the growth is going at a moderate pace. I think that the main risk that we face ahead is some of the most important central bankers become and stay behind the curve, which means that if they allow the economy to grow over what it would be prudent, and in summary, to have a sudden increase of inflation, which might demand a jump in interest rates. I don't think that's the most likely scenario. What I am basically addressing is what we should be watching for is signals. Evidently, when there was that bout of market volatility a few weeks ago in the US particularly, I think it was a market reaction to that possibility. Actually, it didn't materialize, and I think that it came back as it should to the normal process. It began to grow, but evidently, we should be watching to see whether there are no signals of an increase in bubble forming. I think that that's a short. But other than that, I think evidently it's not too fast. It's not the recovery, as you said, some cases it's slow, which I think is normal. Better this way than being too fast and too risky, as 2007 showed.
Do we share that point of view? That in the minister's words, the global economy is okay, perhaps better than okay, growth is moderate, and that if there is a risk, it's a risk in central banks, a risk that policymakers will respond too aggressively to flickers of inflation?
I think the minister is right. Brazil is certainly doing better under his very able stewardship. One thing to emphasize, I think, is that the recovery is global. We've had recoveries in previous years in which we saw one country and one region racing ahead, others lagging behind. This time, pretty much everybody seems to be growing. The world economy is not growing a lot, and you're absolutely right. The recovery from the world financial crisis was very, very slow. So, we economists like to say that it's good or bad compared to what? Compared to the previous years, it looks very, very good indeed. Now, I don't think that the risk of overheating today is the main risk. Yes, there are a couple of countries that are in that situation, but across the board, if you look at Europe, if you look at the US, most measures of inflation seem pretty well put. I worry about sudden losses in confidence. One thing that we learned, if you're from Latin America, we knew this all along. The world, of course, had its big lesson in 2008, 2009. In a world of very volatile capital flows and a lot of liquidity, market sentiment turns on a dime. We saw it a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago by now. In fact, many of you were probably leaving Davos having concluded that the world was a very, very peaceful place the very same day the stock markets in the world began plummeting. So the question, I think, is, do central banks today have the necessary set of tools to deal with that? And when interest rates are very low to begin with, when treasuries find themselves a lot more indebted than they were a decade ago, the toolkit is not as broad. I think that ought to be the kind of thing that should worry us.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Because I'm not an economist, and I am an Argentine. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. Take into account that I do entirely agree that the global situation is better. But my question is, why? Because after the 2008 crisis, there were public policies that were agreed at G20 level that started to have some effects or to recover confidence or whatever, or it's just a coincidence?
Yeah. Well, I think central banks...
Let me maybe intervene. I think when we say, the economy is growing well, but slowly, we always look to the period before 2008, 2009. And then, of course, everything looks a bit slower. But that was fueled by not just credit, but it was fueled by a lot of fraud and greed. Let's be very clear about this. And we had a lot of instruments were sold which were completely worthless. And eventually somebody said, actually, the emperor is naked. And then people started, to throw off, and the markets really crashed in 2000, end of 2008, 2009. I think we're in a very different situation. I mean, I think we have been doing a lot of cleanup, probably not everything. And now we are rebuilding. We are rebuilding employment, consumption, investment, trade, and that, I think, the fundamentals are quite good. And I think that's why, if we grow worldwide 3.5%, in the developed markets between whatever 2 and 3, well, Japan may be a bit lower, and the emerging markets, well, Latin America is around 2.5, but Asia Pacific is coming back with 5, 6, 7%. Even Africa, in most parts, is okayish. I think we are getting back to what we can reasonably expect, and comparing it with something that, is not or should not be repeated, is always a mistake. So we should not feel bad, but we should feel good because the fundamentals look good if we allow them to play out. Now, one of the main drivers, of course, has been trade, and we are now dealing with some, more challenges, not just the US, but also China, India, making life more difficult for trade, for investments, and so forth. And I think that's probably a concern.
I'd like to get back to trade, but if we could stay on this theme for a moment. What you've just said, Hans-Paul, reminds me of many conversations I've had recently with Larry Summers. And I'll pose this question to one of the two economists, or perhaps both here. What if Larry Summers is right? What if we're trapped, or at least what if the developed world is trapped in what he calls a state of secular stagnation? Which is to say that the growth and job creation that we have seen in the United States and other countries, some in Europe, are actually being buoyed not by improving fundamentals, perhaps in part, but also by unsustainable financial conditions. Quantitative easing, perhaps, which is still in force in Europe and in Japan. Or let's just call it easy money. It's a little easier to think of it that way. Budget deficits, like the one that's financing the tax cut. What if he's right?
Larry Summers used to be my boss, so I should agree right away, right?
No,
I think,
no.
I
On the contrary.
think he's partly right, but recent events suggest that only partly. Clearly, if you look at recoveries across decades, this was the slowest recovery in a very, very long time. Not just compared to what happened right before the financial crisis. And parenthetically, you're absolutely right. In the middle of last decade, the growth was artificial. We should not be comparing ourselves to that. But if you go back to the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, this was a very slow recovery. So in that sense, Larry's right. I think Larry's also right to point out that the global savings investment balance in the world has changed. And that's not going away anytime soon. People are saving more, there's less demand for investment, the world real interest rate is low, beyond the little things that central bankers do or don't do. And that's also here to stay. Now, where do I partly disagree with Larry? I think the recovery of the last couple of years is stronger than the thesis would suggest. Maybe it was secular, but secular means it lasts for a century, right? This is not going to last for a century. The alternative version, Ken Rogoff's, another Harvard guy, theory that says that it was not entirely secular, but the recovery was very slow because it was a recovery not just from a recession, it was a recovery from a recession plus a financial crisis. And therefore, mending balance sheets, reducing debt, et cetera, takes a long time, and that made the recovery very, very slow.
Yeah, let me take the Brazilian example, which
Please.
I know best. We began to come out of the recession in 2016. Confidence improved substantially. The whole process seemed that looked at the situation, everyone, that the economy would start moving fast. And evidently that took longer than many analysts expected. And why was that? Exactly because we were in the process of companies deleveraging themselves, which was healthy and necessary. And then after that, the economy began to recover. Then we have to look at specific conditions. And then Brazil grew as a result. And now, this year, for instance, then I would like to address another point, which is the trend of GDP growth, the potential growth, which, if you take Brazilian case, historically, the last 25 years, the average growth rate of Brazil was 3.3. But if you make the adjustment for the demographic changes, that number would come down to close to 2. That would then, in that case, if you simply take that number, that would be the potential. But we have an output gap. In summary, we have a capacity to grow because recession led a good portion of the economy unused, let's put it this way, not to stay in technicalities only. Then we have some room to fill that gap, which let's call the idle capacity of the economy or whatever. And then we have some room to grow at rates higher than the potential. On the other hand, we are working on structural reforms. Then it's absolutely viable that after we fill that output gap, and which would take maybe 3-4 years of higher growth, the structural reforms have already increased the potential, which means that the country could keep growing at higher rates now on a better structural basis. What is my interesting point about the US? Unemployment is already at 4.1.
Yeah.
That's intriguing because evidently potential higher increases, higher growth would have to come from productivity increase and better use of labor, because obviously the results of trying, even in the US, to work as a rate of unemployment which is below, let's suppose, the natural rate or what's possible, that led to problems. And I think that that's a very interesting situation. We could then try to separate what is too slow or too fast, etc. I think we did have some room to grow after the crisis because we came from a low basis. But the question now is, what is the structural capacity of each area to grow without problem, without inflation, which is price of goods and services, but also watching the price of assets, to be sure that they are sustainable as well.
But don't you think we will have an opportunity, I mean, in North America, in parts of Europe, certainly Japan, Korea, Taiwan, including also parts of China, where we are getting to a stage of full employment, labor force participation rate are quite high. In the US, maybe still some room for increasing it. And then we'll see productivity increases coming back again. And then we'll also be able to sustain growth rates of 2-3%, maybe even a bit higher. And I think that would be, again, building on what you asked about Larry Summers' hypothesis about secular stagnation, that will then demonstrate actually there are opportunities and productivity will come back. Now, I'm not saying it will happen, but I think I'm hoping that we'll see signs of that going forward, because we are now hitting certain walls, whether it's labor, whether it's capacities, and so forth.
I'm hoping too, but I'm not betting on it. I think
That's a good point.
The economists around the table will have to confess that we have no good theory of what causes productivity spurs. There's an old line from a famous American economist that runs something like this. We see the effects of innovation everywhere except in the productivity numbers. And if you look at productivity across the world, leave Asia aside for a minute. If you look at Latin America, certainly the productivity numbers over the last couple of decades have been dismal. Maybe this new wave of innovation will do it, but the previous waves of innovation did not do it entirely. So let's keep hoping, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on it. One word on fundamentals while I have the floor. It is true that the previous crisis was a crisis of private debt. And today, private balance sheets in many places, Brazil included, look a lot better. What did change, however, is that we now have a lot of public debt around the world. We Latin Americans used to look around the world, and we had the big debts, right? And the US and Europe did not. Well, today, Brazil has, 60% of GDP? Yeah. Chile has 20% of GDP. It's Germany has 90% of GDP.
No, sorry. Germany has 65.
Well,
let's be honest. No, 60.
Net, not gross.
65% of public debt.
Okay. Again, if you net it, not gross, but still, Japan has 180, Italy is over 100, so we have a change. This debt is not a problem as long as interest rates are very low, right? Because the carrying cost of the debt is not a problem. If central bankers get tough, if the investment savings balance in the world shifts, and therefore real interest rates, not just nominal interest rates, rise, we may have a debt problem again. It's Absolutely. Not around the corner, but it's something to keep an eye on.
That's exactly, I think, the point when we look at the main economies, in the sense that with the interest rate so low, evidently the sustainability of the debt is a much more viable proposition. The question is when we come back to normal monetary policy times, what level of sustainability those that would be, those public debts will be. And that's, I think, the critical question, particularly when we analyze a situation like this last tax reform in the US, and when we see the rise in public debt over the future, it's interesting. Because evidently, the dollar is a reserve currency. But the question is, what's the limit?
Yeah.
And that's the question.
You've created a convenient opportunity for me. I'd like to take a poll among our panelists. Starting with you, Minister, how long do you think it will take for us to get back to normal monetary policy times? How many years are we talking about?
Well, I think it varies from
Of course, no, but in a global
country
sense.
to country. In a global sense, I would say a couple of years, maybe in theory. I am not saying that
We'll see
I'm not saying that this is necessarily what this is going to happen exactly in this time frame, because this will depend on the central bank's decisions. Okay, this is my guess, what normally it seems that should be the time in general. But evidently, that's the point, whether central banks will be on the curve, behind the curve, ahead of the curve, and no one knows that, because if the answer was easy, there would be no problem. Everyone would be right all the time.
I think quite honestly,
the economies would have no crisis.
The answer will be very different. I mean, in Japan, we'll see zero interest rates for a long, long time.
Yeah.
We
Mr.
had
Kuroda is
beforehand.
already talking about,
Sorry?
Mr. Kuroda is already talking about normalization now.
No. So
could take-
normalization for Japan means 0%. No, I mean, okay. In Europe, I think we probably will see, we have another 5, 6, 7 years. When you mean couple, you mean several, or you mean two? I mean, so in Europe, exactly for what you said, and I think, neither Italy nor Greece nor many other countries could afford to pay 5, 6, 7%, interest rates on their debt, because that would really mean, their debt to GDP ratios would go through the roof. And then suddenly we have another crisis because people start losing confidence. That's why the central bank, the European Central Bank, will have to keep interest rates very low. I mean, maybe they move up to 1% or maybe 1.5%, but I think not much more. The US could be a bit different, but I would say it will take quite a while to get back to what we call normal, and I'm sure people have very different ideas about what normal is.
Yeah, I think.
So on balance, a couple here, you
Long
think-
time. I mean,
No, but Hans Paul is absolutely right. We have to get Clintonian here, to quibble about what we mean by normalization. First, across the world, right? The US faster, Europe much slower, Japan even slower than Europe. But let me be a boring economist for 30 seconds. One thing is a nominal interest rate, one thing is a real interest rate. If normal means strongly positive real interest rates, that ain't going to happen anytime soon. In the developed world, of course, Brazil, different cup of tea. But strongly positive real interest rates, I don't think is in the cards anytime in the next 3 or 4 years. And maybe longer.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, what I'm saying. When I say normal, we say normal monetary policy times, we are not talking about the same for everyone.
Right.
okay.
That's the point. We are talking about normal times for a specific country and for characteristics and conditions of that specific country, which varies a lot. For instance, the case of Japan is a tremendous example. The propensity for savings of the Japanese society, but a variety of conditions of that country makes for a very low interest rate normally. We had that in the 90s, we had that after that. It's not something which was brought about the crisis. That was the case for a long time, and that's something, in that case, is specific to Japan. That's my point. We have to come to normal times for every country, what is that? If the country has already reaching the level of natural rate of employment, growing at potential, etc. We are at equilibrium, which could vary. For instance, when first time I joined the government in Brazil, the central bank, the real interest rate over inflation, positive, was 14%. Now it's 3%. I don't think it will go back to that level ever in Brazil, I hope. But what I'm saying is that the equilibrium rate or the neutral rate for Brazil, for instance, is falling. And the challenge here is exactly, in the case of Brazil now, I think for every country, but in the case of Brazil, it's exactly for the central banks to determine what that rate is and balance it.
Well, but besides that, you mentioned before the structural reforms.
Yeah.
Certainly, in the case of the region, the Latin American region, we have a list, a shopping list, the structural reforms that are the labor market. You did mention the question of productivity. Mm-hmm. Certainly, in the past 20 years, I agree. But nowadays, with this technological revolution, I think it will impact the level of productivity, for sure. But also, you need to have retirement system reforms, labor reforms that couldn't be avoided, because if not, you are going at different paces.
Mm-hmm. This raises a question for me that I think you may be able to help answer. When we're talking about the economy, the macroeconomy, we always turn our attention to government actors because they pull the biggest levers.
Yes.
But business plays a role as well. And in the post-crisis period, one word that has entrenched itself in the economic lexicon is sustainability. There's a growing recognition that hiring and investment aren't enough on their own. We hear a lot about this lately from Larry Fink, who runs the world's largest asset management company, BlackRock. He wrote a whole letter about it, in fact, 2 years in a row, to all of the companies in which BlackRock has an investment. So here is the question: is business answering the challenge of sustainable growth?
Well, I think that we are going at different speeds. There is a part of the business society that immediately react and can enter. But what is the main characteristic? Middle and small enterprises are more conservative, are more reluctant. You need to try to push them in order to start the process, because our countries are not possible to have just the M&Es and the big companies running and the others absolutely aside, because at the end of the day, they create jobs, more jobs. Certainly, the gross national product is in one side, but employment and normal life is in the other side. How do you, is possible to join these efforts? I think that is an action. First, confidence in the political leaders, because if there is no confidence in the political leader, doesn't exist. And certainly, in Latin America, we are coming from many years of populism, demagogics. It's much more easy to believe in the state than in the private sector. First. Second, it's easy, and certainly subsidies are better than salaries. That's critical, but it's true. Then we need to create not only the concept of competitiveness at the level of companies, but also productivity at the level of workers, in order to have a level of employment that could be acceptable for the society, because if not, you have political troubles. Then I think that it is a work that we need to face together, and certainly step by step. It's not possible to say from one day to another it will change dramatically. You need to work on that, to believe on the central banks, but also in the real economy, in order to have both parameters.
I think we think there is a contradiction between doing good and doing well, for companies. And BCG has worked on, how do companies perform who really try to take care of all the stakeholders. So not just customers, employees, suppliers, shareholders, of course, too, the communities in which they live in, the environment and so forth. And we have looked at what we call total societal impact, and found that those companies who are high on total TSI are also high in terms of growth, in terms of profitability and performance. So I think there is increasingly a clear notion that if you try to cover the value for the various stakeholders, you do well overall. And just trying to focus on one thing will ultimately hurt you in the business world. I think that's one thing which I think is very important. Then the other thing, of course, is, and I think, Daniel, you referred to it about digitization, automation, creating jobs, and will we become obsolete, starting with consultants, journalists, professors, and whatever, everybody. Maybe not the ministers; they will not become obsolete, but all the rest. And I think we are creating a horror scenario which is wrong. Of course, I cannot prove it, but in many places we will run out of people before we run out of work. I mean, Europe certainly was stagnating. And a declining population, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, even in parts of Asia and China and also North America. So I think one of the key elements will be, and that's also true, of course, for Latin America, rather than saying, okay, everything will be done by machines, there are so many things where we can, especially also young people, create opportunities through education, training, give them jobs. And then I think we can also use digitization for e-health, for training, schooling, whatever, e-government, and really become much more productive, but also, I think, provide the opportunities for a lot more people getting engaged. So I think we need to invest in people, we need to invest in infrastructure, also connectivity within Latin America, rather than being separate. And I think in institutions, and then I think we will be able to deal with these things, and I think business can play a very important role in that.
I do entirely agree, but the key question is, if the economy is running well in the formal sector and with all the technology and so on, the story of our countries and the reality is also a big part of the informal economy. And that's, and it's a different situation that you need to take into account, because it's not easy to make enter this informal economy into the formal one. There are a lot of measures that you can take, but it's not automatic.
No.
Let me chime in here, because I think you've put a really key issue on the table. One area where we can both do good and do well is simply improving the way the labor market works across the world, but particularly in Latin America. You're talking about words that became important since the crisis. One is sustainability, the other one is inequality. There is no way we're going to make a substantial dent in inequality in Latin America unless we provide good jobs at good wages. And the reality is that we have labor markets that are way too informal, that's one issue, that serve young people and women very poorly. We have employment ratios in Latin America which are way lower than those of Europe or the US. My country, Chile, entered the OECD a few years back. Now, if I look at employment ratios in the OECD, Chile, Mexico, and Turkey are always fighting for the last place. On average, 80% of people work in Germany. On average, only 65% of people work in Latin America. And if you look at women, only about 40% of women have jobs, whether formal or informal. That means that that's behind poverty, but it's also behind inequality, because there's nothing that is more sure to leave you at the very bottom of the inequality pile than a family where the husband is absent, where the woman has to make ends meet, and the woman does not have a job. And parenthetically, and I'll end here, I think there's also a role for businesses here, because traditionally in Latin America, businesses have been guilty of something that all of Latin America is guilty of. It's called discrimination, particularly against women, against ethnic minorities, against the poor generally. There's a lot of work to do.
Can I pin you down? What country would you point to as an example of smart policy making on that front that balances the need for growth and inclusiveness?
Countries far away from here, but it's pretty good anywhere. Denmark. Denmark has something called flexicurity, which means it's a labor market that is flexible, but which also provides security. That means that restrictions on hiring and firing are very few, so you get reallocation of labor to high productivity jobs, but at the same time, there's a lot of money being spent on unemployment insurance. You may lose your job, but you don't lose your income, and also on retraining.
But you also have to take jobs.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also you lose your unemployment insurance if you don't show up for the training.
Yeah.
So it is generous, but it is rigorous. It is flexible, but it is also generous and helps families. I think that kind of combination is very far away from what we have in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, and also in the US, parenthetically.
Yeah, but they have a small population in practical.
But can I
Yeah,
also,
I think
maybe say one thing. I think we cause a lot of anxiety by using the word labor market reform or any reform.
Yeah.
Reform is a very bad word.
Yep.
It means somebody wants to take something away from you. And of course, we have to reduce the regulations and make markets more flexible in general. Also here in Brazil, you know that much better than I do, or in Latin America in general. But I would say, just let's start deregulating step by step, without making a big, wahoo about it, just do it.
Big banks typically don't end
Big
well.
banks cause a lot of anxieties. Very small steps, maybe get you to the same solutions, but they will always, impact only small groups of people rather than everybody being negatively impacted.
Yeah, I think that an important point that is becoming clear here is going back to your question, which is whether business is prepared to increase productivity and sustain growth, etc. I think the key questions, and when we use some examples of Latin America on one hand, Denmark on the other hand, is the interaction between, evidently, business and the macro framework. What I'm saying that evidently business works within some framework. And what influences that is several things. For instance, the question of discrimination, as it was mentioned by Andres. Some other cultural issues. The level of education, it's another very important and basic element. So if you take a country like South Korea, for instance, the important and most dramatic change which did take place in South Korea was the increase in the quality of education and the number of people well trained. That was the main driver. Evidently, business took advantage of that. But again, that was a very important macro element. The question of labor laws, for instance. In Brazil, it was the case until, let's say, 2 years ago or even less, that the same company working in Brazil and working in some of these other countries which have, let's call, a more advanced labor legislation, the number of litigations here was 10, 20, 30 times higher. Now, we not use the word reform, but
adaptation.
with the improvement of the labor legislation, let's say, that is enabling several companies to work better, to decrease the number of litigations, and to empower employers and employees over the court ruling. In summary, this is the kind of thing which can change the business environment and creating a different approach to the way managers and corporations react to within that environment.
And let me underline one thing that Hans Paul said that is very, very true. True in Europe, but also true in this part of the world. Labor market reform, phrased that way, is something that is typically viewed as politically unviable, some crazy right-wing thing that is going to take your job away from you. It need not be that way. First of all, because you don't have to do everything at once. But secondly, and more importantly, because if you do this right, this is good for poverty, good for inequality, even good for unions if you do it right. Because unions get to negotiate on a much broader range of things, not simply on wages. And a result, the trend toward de-unionization that you see in many countries could be reversed. So, to put it differently, we haven't done these changes not because you couldn't get 20 economists in a room to agree on them. Many people would. It's simply because they're politically very difficult. But I think the politics of it has been done wrong. There's a better way.
Since you brought it up, let me ask you, how, and let's contextualize it by talking about this part of the world at the very least. How do we improve the representation of women in the workforce? And not just in the workforce, but at the leadership level. seems here in the Southern Cone so paradoxical, given that women have played such a successful role in politics, right? Argentina, Brazil, Chile have all had female presidents.
Absolutely.
And yet, I'm sure you can't, because I can't. Can you name a large company in this part of the world that's owned by a woman?
This is a tremendous issue, and one that in Chile in recent months and years has elicited a lot of discussion. And there's no one button that you push to change things immediately, but there are a number of things. The first one, the softer one, simply information. If you publicize information on the composition of boards, both in private and public companies, that brings a lot of shame onto a lot of companies very quickly.
Transparency, in other words.
Transparency. In Chile, we began doing that, and suddenly, things began to change. In the realm of politics, I know this is controversial, but I'm for it. At least for a transition period, you need quotas. In Chile, we had the first election ever in which parties had to put forward candidates that were at least 40% women, and it made an impact. May not be there forever, but at least for a transition to redress past wrongs, you have to do it. And in terms of private employment, we don't have to reinvent the rule. In Germany, in the United States, you have very stringent anti-discrimination legislation. And if your company is caught doing something that the law does not allow, you're first shamed and then you're fined. That sort of thing is in its infancy in Latin America. We have a long way to go. I realize it's controversial, but it is very necessary.
Now, I would also add, I think one of the key elements is making sure that we do invest, and you have already said it before, in education and in training. And we also deplore, and I heard that this morning over breakfast, there are not enough good skilled people in Brazil, in Latin America. And so, given that very often girls are doing better in school, women at university, I think there will be an enormous pull for the talent. And I think if we give them a good education, a good training at university or apprenticeships and so forth, we will also get a lot of pull for women, because everybody who's not going for the top talent would be stupid. It's like saying, I'm wasting energy. I mean, why should you waste energy? It costs money. So let's be energy efficient, let's be resource efficient, let's go for the top talent, irrespective of gender and background and so forth. Let's make sure that this works, And I think there we need to invest a lot more in the education side, and then we'll not automatically, but I think we'll see, things are getting better, like we have seen in North America and Europe, and we see it in Asia already quite a lot, in China, in Japan is starting also, but also Southeast Asia, we see a lot more women, and slowly also in India. Daniel.
Yeah, first I want to clarify something that is very important. We have all the international instruments in order to avoid discrimination. Legally, excellent framework. Reality, far from there. First, cultural reasons in some regions, and are reluctant, and during 35 years I was leading at the ILO, the employers group. We went to some regions in Africa or Asia where there were problems, and that problems remain. Certainly, education is the way to transform it, but it's a long process. I think that globalization is useful also for this process. But the second question, and during these years at the G20 we discussed also, is the question of women participation. Let me tell you that for the first time this year, we will have at the B20 26% of women participation. In Germany it was 14, okay, let's say. But making a lot of pressure in order to make understand the women that need to participate. Because certainly there are questions of agenda. Certainly you need to compatibilize jobs and other activities, and you need to enter into that. Then I think it's a process in progress, and it has to be one of the flagships of globalization process. We cannot accept in a global world that remains such type of discrimination that remain in place in many places.
Before we turn the floor over to questions, turn questions to the floor, I think we need to talk about trade. Let's talk about trade. You brought it up earlier, Hans Paul. I'll put the question to you, Minister, if I may, to begin. My colleagues at Bloomberg Economics have estimated that a full-blown trade war, and that's not what we have yet, would cost the global economy $470 billion. It's a pretty big number. Is that where we're headed? I mean, let me ask you directly, because it would help to establish some context. We've heard that Brazil is considering retaliatory measures. Could apply to the deal Boeing and Embraer are cooking up. It could apply to the Open Skies Agreement that Brazil has with the United States. How seriously do countries, and Brazil as an example, how seriously do countries need to think about retaliation? And if you retaliate, are we inevitably headed toward a trade war?
Two things. Let's separate issues here. The first, let's say, the reaction towards this specific measure.
The aluminum and steel tariffs.
Yeah, aluminum and steel. Evidently, that's negative. I think, for starters, for American industry, because it becomes costlier, the imports of steel and aluminum from most of the countries, and for American consumers, and evidently for exporters as well. Then, let's say, globally, the productivity level falls down somewhat. Maybe one or two industries in the US or more, but some specific industries might profit from that. But overall, the American industry loses from my vantage point, and evidently the Brazilian steel makers directly as well. And having said that, in terms of what's the reaction, evidently we are thinking about talking to World Trade Organization and moving or not to it, depending on how other countries would decide to do, whether they would be prepared to act together, this kind of thing. And at the same time, the administration, American administration, is talking about negotiations. And the question is, what are the negotiations they are talking about? And what do they want to negotiate? And that's exactly the point. I mean, the position has to become clearer for the ground to become clearer for all these discussions. And having said that, let's go back now to the overall situation. I would expect and maybe hope that the world doesn't get into a trade war. We have experimented that in the past. We had that in the 30s. It was very bad result. And we have a very extensive experience with that in Brazil. We have had a protected economy. We had some of the highest tariffs in the world for several products during a long time. Actually, Latin America now has higher tariffs than many of other regions. I'm not talking about Chile specifically, but necessarily that's the case. And in the case of Brazil, for sure. And that was the case for a long time. And that was not necessarily good for Brazil, the fact that the economy was closed. Now, we are exactly on the opposite way. We are beginning, now actually not beginning, we are already on negotiation, discussion, very advanced with the European Union for an open trade agreement. We are already talking to the UK about a future trade agreement after Brexit, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In summary, I think that's the way to go.
So not to retaliate.
We are not discussing exactly what to do now, but I don't think that that's necessarily is the best route. What we should do, only to make things very clear, is exactly when the American administration talks about negotiating on what? It's actually their call in terms of what do they want to negotiate. And if they want to negotiate, let's sit and talk and negotiate.
How about one more word on trade, and then let's get some
Can I
questions
say,
from
I think we all would agree that we should avoid trade wars question. I think that we all suffer. I think the minister made it very clear that the import substitution policy in Latin America and Brazil in particular for many, many years, even decades, has not made things better. I'm afraid, for a while I also disregarded what President Trump has been saying, but I'm afraid that he thinks in very simple terms, and that is, I win, you lose. And I don't think through the implications and so forth. And okay, now if you retaliate, I will start with the next group of category of products. And even if you don't retaliate, if you want to negotiate, I don't give you anything. But I still impose, go the next step, whether it's cars, that would hurt, Japan, Germany, of course, and other countries, Mexico, certainly. Then I blow up NAFTA because in the end I'm not satisfied. I just want to put pressure on you. And so I'm just, using my baseball stick and hitting and hitting and hitting, no matter what the implications are. I think that's the real danger. We're not dealing with somebody as thoughtful as you, No, so I mean, and who then says, okay, let's negotiate and find something where we all get to a solution which we can all live with.
The bottom line, only to finalize a very important issue. The bottom line, I think, what I think definitely it's going to happen now, from our vantage point here, is that I think there is a much stronger now motivation and conditions to really advance on trade negotiations with Europe and other regions of the world. As a result of that, that's the point. That's, I think, at the end of the day, that's the bottom
Could be
line.
positive. That,
Which would be positive.
the negative could be positive.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Parenthetically, we had such a nice time for half an hour not mentioning Donald Trump. Did we
I was
really
going to
have
say, it took
come round
us
to this?
49 minutes before his
Two
name was
thoughts.
mentioned.
Your question is really not a question about retaliation. Your question is a question about what will Donald Trump do next. Because steel and aluminum are something like 2% of world trade. So if he stops there, no war. If he goes further, retaliation will happen. Now, could I pretend to forecast what a completely irrational man could do next? No, I'm not in that business. Who knows? But secondly, I think Henrique made a really good point. Last week in Santiago, 11 countries signed the TPP, the Asia-Pacific Agreement, in the absence of the United States. When Trump pulled out, people thought, oh, this is not going to happen. Well, the New Zealanders and others took leadership there, and there it is. In Latin America, the Pacific Alliance, including Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, is getting very stronger. We would love to converge with Brazil and Argentina and Mercosur. And let's be even more ambitious. Back in, 91, George Bush Sr. proposed a free trade area of the Americas. Donald Trump is not going to propose it, but let's do a free trade area of the Americas without the United States. How's that for bow thinking?
That's the point. That's exactly the point.
I think it's important that we at least get one or two questions. We started a little bit late. I'm looking at the boss. Do we have time for one? One question from the floor. Don't all raise your hands at once. There we go, right here in the front row, please. And if you don't mind, please identify yourselves so that...
My name is Andrea.
No, you need to.
I am from Bolivia. And I was just wondering why a group of men are talking about women problems. Why you are not invited a woman to talk about women problems?
I can help to answer that question. That is, by the way, that is an excellent question, and I can answer it two ways. Speaking on behalf of the World Economic Forum, and I am familiar with the efforts that were made, great efforts were undertaken to try and bring at least one, if not more, female panelists to this stage. Regrettably, they didn't pay off. And I hope that in the future, the opportunity to talk about it in this way will inspire more women to say yes to that invitation and to join conversations like this. So it wasn't an oversight, let me put it. And secondly, I would say, it's a fair question, but, it's not really a but, if, and I hope I speak for all of us here, women and men have to solve that problem, right? If women alone can't solve the problem, men have to solve the problem on behalf of women as well. It would be much better if we did it together. Agree, 100%.
And I would also add that evidently there's the kind of discrimination that still there is against women. It's a very serious one because obvious reasons. But in addition to that, we have also to talk about other kind of discrimination which do exist. But the fact that we are talking, I think, here about that is better than if there were no talk because there is no women here. That's the point. I think that's the critical, most important point, but you are right. Next time you should have one.
Even there is an international campaign, he for she. That's the answer.
And with that, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their contributions.